From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I am Sonia Gray. Colombian presidential candidate Gustavo Petro has received the support of key leaders of the Green Alliance, Senator-elect Antana Mocas and Senator Claudia Lopez. Both Mocas and Lopez were central figures in Sergio Fajardo's campaign. The endorsement may be an important one as Fajardo received the third largest share of votes, coming in third in the first round of elections on May 27th and receiving over 4 million votes. Petro and Mocas signed a 12-point agreement in which Petro agreed to not call for a National Constituent Assembly and advance the implementation of the anti-corruption proposals.
I'm personally here to exercise the right to choose my vote. It is a right that every citizen has. I'm part of the Green Party, and we have decided that we could either abstain from voting or to vote for Gustavo Petro. So we choose Petro.
And still in Colombia, the Election Observer Mission says there are still doubts about the transparency of the presidential runoff on June 16th. A number of political sectors have come together to demand guarantees.
10 days before the second round of the presidential elections, the Electoral Observation Mission has explained why there are still concerns regarding this runoff, following allegations of irregularities in the first round on May 27th.
We have a system that is vulnerable to human error, to any alteration that may modify the results, and this is serious.
On top of this, there are complaints of other electoral crimes.
There have been complaints about illegal influencing of voters, such as telling citizens they will lose their jobs unless they vote for or against a specific candidate.
Gustavo Petro, who had already warned of possible electoral fraud, says the National Electoral Registry failed to obey a ruling by Colombia's Council of State.
There was no audit of the software used during the elections. The rulings were disobeyed.
Petro said that his campaign has presented 27 formal complaints to the Electoral Council.
There's been a series of irregularities with the E14 forms, dubious amendments, and manipulation of voting records. We detected 4,000 cases ourselves.
During an event called the Great Coalition for Peace, political leaders from different sectors, including the former candidates Clara Lopez and Ingrid Betancourt, and indigenous representatives came together to say that it is time to confront the broken political machinery head-on in order to defend democracy and free thinking at the polls.
We share the same vision for Colombia. We ask that Colombians join us in fighting this repulsive mechanism.
In this way, despite the fact that many traditional parties have fallen in line with Ivan Duque, many other political and social leaders are independently joining Gustavo Petro and other social organizations to demand guarantees for the runoff elections.
Our correspondent in Bogota, Paula Fernandez, has more on that major Petro endorsement we just told you about from the key leaders of the Green Alliance.
A few hours ago, two political figures that headed the campaign of former presidential candidate Sergio Fajardo, Claudia Lopez and Antana Mocas, endorsed Gustavo Petro's campaign. They started their alliance in a symbolic act called the Peace Coalition. They said that they had political differences in the past, but not ethical differences. Claudia Lopez led a campaign against corruption in Colombia, saying that certain differences can be helpful to build a better nation. Mocas said that Ivan Duque wasn't a good choice and he will vote for Gustavo Petro.
We thank Paula for that report. In Mexico, the leading leftist candidate ahead of the presidential polls in July, Andres Manuel López Obrador, made a campaign stop in a small town in the violence-plagued state of Guerrero on Thursday. López Obrador has told voters he is prepared to analyze all options to improve security, including an amnesty to bring peace to Mexico. At least 18 politicians have been killed in Guerrero since September, and the increase in violence has contributed to more support of López Obrador.
Esta es una región This is a region that is very important to us because there is a lot of poverty and abandonment. I tell you now that I'm coming back to Tapla as president-elect.
Argentina and the International Monetary Fund have agreed on a loan of $50 billion over a 3-year period. The agreement is subject to approval by the IMF board, but its director, Christine Lagarde, has already congratulated the Argentinian government. She said the plan is owned and designed by the government and is aimed at strengthening the country's economy. Argentina's president, Mauricio Macri, requested the IMF assistance last month after its currency plunged as investors withdrew from emerging markets. Macri's announcement triggered weeks of protests against a deal with the IMF.
We have agreed on a standby access, the amount of 50 billion. This is 11 times greater than Argentina's quota, which is reflective of the support of the international community for Argentina. It is very good news. The integration of Argentina to the world, which allows us to have this level of support.
And despite low public investment in Panama, the IMF has recommended cuts in the budget for social development, which has driven the country's growth in recent years. Some economists say that this will hurt the majority of the population, especially the poor.
These are the buildings presented on the front pages of magazines as the image of Panama's economic growth. In order to maintain that image, the International Monetary Fund has recommended to reduce budgets for social development.
These recommendations of cuts in the budgets for social attention and services is nothing but a capitalist plan to reduce the quality of life that the people of the world deserve. In Panama's case, these adjustments must not take place, and our organizations will fight them.
According to the Economic Council for Latin America and the Caribbean, only 7.4% of Panama's GDP is invested in social development. It's one of the lowest in the region. Also, the country only invests 3% of its GDP in education and has a housing deficit of 150,000 houses. 25% of the population has no sanitary services, and 5% has no access to drinking water. 11% suffer malnutrition, and 19% are not properly fed. 11% of the population has dirt floors in their homes, and this might get worse by following the IMF's recommendations.
This exclusive economic model concentrates great wealth and reduces public spending. It increases the national economy by damaging the social situation.
According to the last official statistics, almost 20% of Panamanians live in poverty, and they would be the most affected if these austerity measures are applied.
The point is that we are economically growing, but how? And who controls that wealth? This shows that Panama is a socially unequal country and that this is caused by a concentration of power and resources in just a few regions and in the hands of 150 ultra-millionaires.
The situation for many in this Central American country shows how economic growth doesn't go along with human development. It is necessary to apply more policies to give equal opportunities to all people.
As Barbados heads to the IMF, the monetary organization pushed for serious cuts to expenditure, containment of wages, and reform of government pensions. And while they say the country needs to reprofile its debt, they caution that it should not be done unilaterally. But those recommendations run counter to the promises of the newly elected Prime Minister made on the campaign trail, especially as it relates to free university education, which has a huge cultural significance in Barbados. But as Jeremy Stevens explains, the government owes the University of the West Indies $250 million, and that complicates matters. Earlier, we spoke to the economist Jeremy Stevens, who broke down what implementing IMF recommendations could mean to a Motley administration in its infancy.
I don't believe that she will be on board with that advice. I will tell you, since free tertiary education was removed in Barbados since 2013, 2012, 2013. And funnily enough, I work for the same tertiary institution that I would love to have the free education again, because it really does help by the way of revenue. But she has been a staunch fighter against the removal of free tertiary education. So I know it's not going to resound with her particularly well. I will say that most Barbadians, however, do not think it is likely, although most people would like it to happen. Most people don't believe that it's likely, considering that the government owes the University of the West Indies upwards of 500 million Barbados dollars, so that's 250 million US and above. Further to that, the pensions, actually, the rising of non-contributory pensions and contributory pensions are actually were the bigger pulls, if you can call it that, or the bigger things that people wanted or they liked from her campaign. And those the IMF also cautioned against. Funnily enough, that's running in line with what most economists locally were saying, that although the gesture is good, our economy is built on what you call a high social safety net for all. You want to be reasonable and you want to protect your vulnerable. And I understand the political ideology there, that you want to ensure that if there is some form of austerity, that the older amongst you can survive. But it's not, I still don't see how it's fundable. And clearly the IMF agrees with me as well, and others.
And Barbados's economic problems, which sent it to the IMF, could signal more economic hardship for Trinidad and Tobago, because as that country's Prime Minister explains, the two economies are intertwined.
And for those of you who don't understand, Barbados is not alone in that matter. We are there with them. Because Barbados' success is our success, and Barbados' pain is our pain. For those of you who have been following the news from Barbados, you would have heard in the very first week of the new government, the government has announced they're going to the IMF and they're going to restructure the economy. We have to wait now and see what are the conditionalities of that restructuring. But the government has already announced what is in effect a default in handling the debt and in handling commercial arrangements in Barbados. Before you understand the full extent of this for you here in Trinidad and Tobago, you have to wait for the government to tell you, because the others will not tell you, the exposure of Trinidad and Tobago's businesses to the conditions that will apply in Barbados.
Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves, and the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Bruce Golding, are tackling the English-speaking Caribbean's perennial problem of regional integration. At a CARICOM consultation in Guyana, the two posited the reason for a lack of regional integration comes from a lack of cultural unity in the Caribbean, where they feel more in touch with American or European culture and history than their own. The two leaders called for more dialogue with the people to explain the benefits of regional integration.
It is not our shared path that is going to drive us forward. It is the perception that we have a shared future, that there are benefits that can flow from our holding hands and facing that future together. But I suggest in all humility that that is a case that has not yet been made. If the leaders themselves have doubt about that shared future, can you imagine what is happening in the minds of the people?
And Prime Minister of St. Vincent, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, says it's time to change the Caribbean's economic model.
Talk to the population in a manner and ask them to come along with you in this redesign of that model which has grown up since independence and what has happened in the new circumstance. So that's, and our population don't want to hear about a different kind of a possible design. And we are going to see with great interest how many of them are going to turn out. We are living them, you know. Jamaica with the IMF and what has happened subsequently, Barbados now with the IMF, Trinidad with its own kind of approach.
We're going to take a short break now, but join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting.
The world has visited many terrible things on the Palestinian people, none more shameful than robbing them of their basic humanity. I'm the worst person in the world to look to for a message. I'm a bad role model.
Welcome back. In Guatemala, rescue efforts have ceased in the areas most affected by the volcanic eruption in towns around the Escuintla district. Families of the hundreds of missing have been denied the possibility of finding the bodies of their loved ones.
The Paniagua family is continuing their own search for their loved ones after the official announcement to cease rescue operations. They say that they will continue working as long as necessary. They refuse to leave the bodies buried.
We are going to continue looking for them until we find them. We think that the bodies are here, but they are not in this side. Here is a living room where the house is buried.
The anxiety around finding their families has them working with their own tools, exposing themselves to the vulnerable terrain. But for them, this is the least that can be done. Below the volcanic material and tons of sand are the bodies of the people they love the most.
8 family members have disappeared, and only one has been found. Only my grandmother and many uncles and cousins are buried. All of them are still buried.
The scene is bleak in what was the community of Los Lotes. Only tons of sand, rocks, remains of the families, and the households where the victims were caught off guard remain here. There are no rescue brigades left in the area, and the terrain reflects the intense danger.
We're trying to recover the largest number of people possible. As we have mentioned, it is difficult to get access through the volcanic material because of high temperatures.
But for now, the authorities have declared the place a cemetery, without an accurate count of how many people were burned.
Campesinos from various states of Brazil have participated in the 17th Congress on Agroecology in Curitiba, where social movements are gathered to demand justice for former President Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva. Our correspondent in Curitiba, Ignacio Limas, has more.
We're moving along in Paraná Avenue in Curitiba, where thousands of campesinos without lands are marching. They just finished the Agroecology Day and are now marching towards the headquarters of the federal police, where Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva has been detained for 2 months now. They ask for Lula's freedom and to respect his right to participate in October's presidential elections. They've been marching up and down the hills of Curitiba towards the federal police building. Thousands of campesinos without lands, as you can see.
In Nicaragua, officials from the Catholic Church met with President Daniel Ortega on Thursday to help push peace. They gave the president a proposal to restart national dialogue, which had previously stalled. Our correspondent in Managua, Maria Jose Diaz, brings us more.
The tense atmosphere continues in Nicaragua. This Friday morning, opposition groups reportedly burned down the state radio station Nicaragua Radio. On the other hand, on Thursday, the Episcopal Conference announced through a public statement that the meeting with President Daniel Ortega has an environment of serenity and honesty, in which bishops presented an agenda with the democratization of the country, similar to what was requested by the opposition. Bishops are now waiting for an answer. Once Ortega responds, they will call for the national dialogue to resume. Demonstrations continue across the country. 2 people were killed in disturbances that are beginning to affect everyday people. For that reason, the Ministry of Public Health made a call for the free movement of ambulances to be respected throughout the country.
Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department announced on Thursday they will impose visa restrictions on Nicaraguan government officials. It accuses them of human rights violations during the violent protests that began in April. And although no names were announced, U.S. Secretary of State said it will be applied to local government officers, health ministry authorities, and police officials. He said their relatives could also have the same restrictions applied. In Chile, an initiative by the Teachers College of Chile is aimed at ending patriarchal dominance in education while emphasizing the role of women throughout history in schools. Our correspondent in Santiago, Tiare Valenzuela, tells us more.
I'm outside the Teachers College of Chile headquarters, where just a moment ago the No Sexist Education program was presented following the demonstrations by thousands of women in the country urging for the end of the sexual abuse culture. The program is aimed at ending the toxic chauvinist culture in education curricula. It will hopefully put into value the role of women in schools and on campuses. One example is 90% of the authors that are studied in philosophy courses are male. The goal now is to bring equality to the courses.
At the G7 summit in Quebec, representatives of European Union countries agreed that the conditions to readmit Russia to the group of advanced economies were not met yet. Some heads of states also said that it is highly unlikely that the group will issue a final communique after the 2-day summit due to a lack of consensus. Just before heading off to the summit, President Trump called for the return of Russia to the bloc, saying that Russia should have been attending this year's meeting. But German Chancellor Angela Merkel said it was too soon to tell, saying that if they did not, it would be an honest reflection that no agreement had been reached.
During the European coordination, the topic of Russia played an issue, and we agree that the return by Russia to the G7 format cannot happen as long as there isn't any substantial progress in regard to the problems with Ukraine. That was the common view.
And now we can take a look at some more stories making headlines around the world.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is on a state visit to China. He met with Chinese President Xi Jinping to mark the increasing ties between the two countries in the wake of U.S.-inflicted diplomatic and economic challenges. During the visit, Putin was honored with China's first friendship medal.
We both believe that the current trade protectionism has increased, and there are many uncertainties in the recovery of the world economy. Economic globalization and regional economic integration are the trend of the times.
The UN has warned a Saudi-led airstrike on Yemen's port of Hudaida could wipe out 250,000 people. Jens Lerke, spokesman for the United Nations Humanitarian Office, said in a news briefing that out of the 600,000 people who live in and around the port, 250,000 are at risk of losing everything, including their lives. Most food and medical supplies preventing famine or cholera enter through the port. Elsewhere, the International Committee of the Red Cross announced yesterday that they pulled 71 international staff out of Yemen due to the security situation, moving them to Djibouti. Jacob Zuma, the former South African president, told a crowd of supporters today that corruption charges against him should be dropped, insisting that there's been no misconduct on his part in a $2.5 billion arms deal. His statement came as he appeared in court for the second time. Zuma faces 16 charges of fraud, racketeering, corruption, and money laundering after a deal to buy European military hardware. His supporters argue that he's a victim of a politically motivated witch hunt.
And we've come to the end of this news brief, but for these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at talisyourtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Soini Gray. Thank you so much for watching.
In South America and the Caribbean, we face challenges, looking for ways of contributing to solutions to the nations. With a uniting feeling,